Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
This week, Art Carden joins us. Art is the Margaret Gage Bush Distinguished Professor of Economics at the Brock School of Business at Samford University in Alabama. Art has co-authored the book with Caleb Fuller, Mere Economics, which is what we'll be talking about today. I've known Art for many years and thoroughly enjoy his company, and I thoroughly enjoyed this book, I have to tell you. I'll start off here with a little bit of background. This book, now Art, you teach at a Christian school, yes, Samford University?
I do, yes.
This book, I shouldn't say attacks, it discusses economics, but through the eyes of religion, or specifically Christian religion. I've got to tell you, I've danced around that intersection of religion and economics several times in my career, depending on who the audience is. And you have just done a yeoman's job here of drawing linkages. I think it's just beautiful.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
So let me start you off with my first question. Look,
okay.
You've written this book aimed at what I would describe as conservative Christians who, in my experience, are pretty much free market economic thinkers to begin with. Are you preaching to the choir here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I wonder if maybe in some sense we are, but I think the last decade has shown that a lot of rhetoric about free markets does not actually mean that people understand and truly support free markets. So just the last presidential election, there was an awful lot of discussion of regulation and an awful lot of discussion of getting the government off our backs. But it's okay for the government to get on people's backs if they're buying stuff from foreigners, or if they're hiring foreigners to do jobs. There's first a real tension there. And then second, with the national conservatism movement, they're being, I think, pretty explicit in some cases about rejecting laissez-faire liberal capitalism. So I suspect we have a lot of sympathetic readers, a lot maybe who don't know that they aren't, in fact, as free market as they would like to be, or as they would like us to think they are. And also, I think, too, people who think that there's a tension between economics and faith, and economics and Christian faith specifically. I think we do a reasonable job of showing that, no, the two aren't actually in tension. You don't have to set aside the economic way of thinking when you go to church, and you don't have to set aside your faith when you enter an economics classroom or an economics discussion.
In my experience of talking about the intersection of faith and economics, I found the audience's eyes are open because people seem, at least Americans, seem so used to kind of the default position that, well, if you care about the poor, then you must be in favor of socialistic policies.
Yeah, that's something I know we've all heard, usually from the left, but claims that Jesus was a socialist, or the early church practiced socialism, or some variation on, well, socialism just means sharing, or socialism just means caring about other people, or Tim Walz said in the run-up to the last election that, one person's socialism is another person's neighborliness. That being a socialist just means being a good neighbor. It means just wanting good things. Obviously, you and I would agree that's not the case, that socialism is something much deeper. But also, one of my missions in life is I kind of want people to stop giving themselves credit for meaning well. And of course, at a Christian university, there are a lot of people who mean very, 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 very well. And it's not always clear that our good intentions translate into good results.
Let me back up for a moment. I jumped over the title, Mere Economics, but I've got a note here I wanted to ask you to speak to that a little bit. When you say mere economics, you don't mean mere in a denigrating sense.
No, not at all. So a little bit of backstory on the book. So I've been telling people for years I wanted to write a book called Mere Economics. And several years ago, I was doing a podcast or a webinar for Liberty Fund, and just happened to casually mention, someday I want to write a book called Mere Economics. And then I got an email from Caleb Fuller saying that he too also had been saying for a long time he wanted to write a book called Mere Economics. And it turned out we were completely on the same page. We wanted to write the same book.
Yeah.
So we said, all right, fine. Okay, you want to write this, I want to write it. We're of one accord in this whole endeavor, so let's give it a shot. And this was the result. And when we say mere economics, it's not in any sort of sense of denigrating anything. It is a play on C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And we describe the book sometimes as what would happen if you threw mere Christianity into a blender with Thomas Sowell's basic economics. We really want to keep our eye on the ball and focus on the most essential points about economics that a lot of people, including perhaps a lot of economists, are confused on, or the W.H. Hutt, the great economist, would say woolly in terms of how they think about it. We say in the book that if you like American football metaphors, this is about blocking and tackling. We'll leave like the complicated offensive and defensive schemes to the upper level electives and the graduate classes and things like that. This is an exercise in blocking and tackling, and I hope kind of resetting how we understand the sources of prosperity.
And I have to say, I think you've done an excellent job of attacking economics like we did in our book in a way that is both interesting to someone who understands the economics and enlightening to someone, and certainly readable to someone with no background in economics.
Yeah. The goal of the book, we said, are very, very high bar that socialists would embrace free market capitalism, non-economists would become economists, and atheists would become Christians. And I think maybe we're, 1 out of 3, 2 out of 3 is a possibility. It is something that I hope anyone who reads it can take something that they didn't know or didn't understand before, whether it be about Christian faith or about the economic way of thinking, or just about practical ways to live.
Now, you're speaking to specifically an American Christian audience. Being a Catholic, I was surprised no mention of John Paul II, who's written several encyclicals. Of course, he came from behind the Iron Curtain, but several encyclicals, to my reading, read as if he's promoting free market economics. And in fact, at one point in, I think it's Centesimus Annus, he says, if free market means that basically property rights are respected and people are free to make choices provided they aren't harming others, then he's all for that. In fact, he's got a great quote to the effect of, absolutely, the employer should not exploit the worker. Which, of course, you read that and the socialists are cheering. And then he goes right on and says, but the worker should not exploit the employer.
Right. Yeah. So there were a lot of hard choices that needed to be made as we're preparing the book, because we wanted to keep it short enough that people would actually read it. So therefore, we had to leave a lot of really great stuff out. We actually have a longer document in Google Drive called More Economics, which might be the follow-up. Or someday we were talking about writing a book called Summa Economica. I don't know that we talk about John Paul II in anything that we left on the cutting room floor, but this is a very good and very important point that for John Paul II, especially, like you mentioned, coming from behind the Iron Curtain, how society self-organize is, first of all, more than just an academic discussion, because you got to see communism up close and personal. And then second, there's a lot of commonality between what little I understand about Catholicism, qua Catholicism, and free market ideas, and what I do understand about the Protestant side of the aisle.
All right. So, James, I'm going to go to you here in a second, but I want to jump in and push back on you a little bit.
Sure.
You have a chapter in which you talk about the poor, and you make the argument, as I've made as well, James has made as well, that private charity is much better at taking care of the poor than the government could ever hope to be. And as I'm reading that, I'm writing down a note here of what happens when voluntary giving isn't enough. And sure enough, I come to later in the chapter, you say, voluntary giving might not be enough. But the answer to that is, and I perceive just a bunch of hand waving, frankly, of, we need to be better at voluntary giving.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. So when I think about voluntary giving and the sufficiency of it, one of the questions that we have to answer is, to what extent is giving of any kind really necessary in an extremely wealthy society? The card that we probably pull out of our sleeve would be the economic growth card. So if you redistribute less, at least get rid of some of the pathological incentives that are embedded in the welfare state, you get more economic growth, and that lessens the need for charity of just about any kind. I tell my students this: if we're going to have a government and if they're going to redistribute, then simple taxes and transfers would be something I'm not ready to go to the barricades over. But I also think there's the strong argument to be made that we would be able to take care of the real serious and genuine needs. And I hate using that word needs, as all economists should hate using the word needs. We should be able to take care of those with voluntary mechanisms, in part because we would have greater economic growth. Second, need, and I'm making air quotes here for people who are listening, need is endogenous, as economists are fond of saying. Needs are, in a lot of cases, the response to people's incentives. So I wonder how many needs would manifest themselves or how many needs would appear if more people were responsible for their own care. And that might sound harsh, but I think specifically back to the examples of the original settlement of the American colonies and some of the settlers, they had a kind of quasi-socialist experiment. Everybody's starving to death. Then finally they say, we're going to abandon this. Everyone gets their own private plot and you're responsible for feeding yourself and your family. And then all of a sudden, a lot of people who had these intractable, incurable ailments suddenly started feeling better when they could produce their own sustenance for themselves and their loved ones. To shorten the answer, I'll say one, that there's always going to be need. We're always going to be able to find something we can call a need. And second, need emerges in part as a response to the incentives that are in place. So I think we get rid of the incentives, we reduce the need. We get rid of the bad incentives, we increase economic growth, we reduce the need, and private sector charity, I think, is more than sufficient to cover the really hard edge cases.
Okay, I want to follow up on that a little bit. I'm going to start by saying I just don't think I have to offer my anti-government bona fides here. I think everybody kind of knows that to whatever degree you and I might disagree on this, it's a disagreement of degree, not of kind.
Right. Yeah.
But, you know, in my former life, I used to work in mental institutions, and I can tell you I've seen people who cannot take care of themselves. And it's always seemed to me, you know, when we think about the Christian perspective, when Jesus said the poor will always be among you, I think at this point we could say the disabled will always be among you. And that's maybe a better thing to say, right? It captures more of the truth of the matter.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of ways, we don't suffer from biting poverty as we once did. And I think your admonition to think about needs a little differently is well advised. But I've met people, lots and lots of people who in no way could care for themselves. And I know there's a lot more out there than I've ever met. And my deepest concern comes when we think about private charity and I ask the question, but what happens when it's not enough? And you start to see the state as the insurer of last resort, right? The thing that can, the only thing that can provide that last bit of coverage when you think about it in those terms. And I'm wondering, do you think we can ever actually get away from that?
So that's an interesting question because there are sort of two ways the conversation would have to proceed. One is, here I'm borrowing from Mike Munger, the directional versus the destinational. On one hand, we can talk about the destination. Okay, so what does libertopia actually look like? You know, is there a government? How big is the government? What does it do? That, again, is, I think, a very interesting and largely academic discussion. My former colleague, John Murray, has written a fantastic book. It was published in 2007 called Origins of American Health Insurance, where he makes a very strong and, I think, convincing argument that the reason we didn't get a European-style welfare state in the United States was largely because friendly societies and the institutions of civil society were doing a very, very good job. From a directional perspective, we want to sort of step back and start from where we are and say, in what direction do we want to go? Like, if your only hang up is roads and mental institutions, then that's great. Okay, fine. We'll have government mental institutions. We'll let the government build the roads. And then after we've gotten rid of all the other stuff that we can all sort of agree is wasteful, then we can start to talk about, okay, do we really, truly, positively, absolutely need government-run mental institutions or government-created roads? And again, like I said, the specific phrasing I use with my students is we got rid of the welfare state as we currently know it and just replaced it with a much more generous earned income tax credit. I would sleep very, very well at night. I would call that a win. If we got rid of most of the pathological income redistribution and welfare programs we have, that create benefit cliffs and all the other stuff that the economist Casey Mulligan is constantly talking about. I'm not going to lose a lot of sleep, and I'm not going to go to the barricades to shut down the state-funded mental institutions at that point. It's a conversation we can have, certainly, and one where I think that the libertarian free market paradise would provide enough or more than enough to care for those who truly cannot care for themselves. But again, that's not a hill I'm going to die on. At least right now, we're talking about how big the government should be.
My wish is that we do actually die on that hill at some point in the future.
At some point, yeah. So Ronald Coase, someone once asked him, how big should the government be? And he replied, when a 300-pound man walks past you and you ask, how much should that man weigh? The answer is less. So I think that's I take kind of a Coasean approach to the how big should the government be question.
I want to change gears for a minute. You mentioned taxes. You have an entire chapter devoted to this. And you talk about, I don't think you use the word sin tax specifically, but you do talk about taxes on things that, that might be good for people to consume less of. Mm-hmm. And I'm very interested in reading this to see what your punchline is. Perhaps you did this deliberately, but you went off in talking about the negatives of such taxes. You went off and talked about the unintended consequences, which absolutely I agree with you 100%.
Right.
I was left wanting for the more theologically based argument against sin taxes. That, on the one hand, from a policy perspective, if you're using the government to enforce a moral code, you're giving the government power that's going to allow the people who you disagree with to then enforce whatever code they think that you might not find so moral. Secondly, it implies somehow that morality is perhaps relative in that it's up for a vote. And it's on this piece where if there's one thing in which I have found I clash with conservative Christian audiences, it's on that topic of, does the government have a role in enforcing morality?
So there, in our chapter on the economics of sin and prohibition, we're trying to do a few things. And the most important one is just to make people think about the unintended consequences. Saying it is bad or immoral or wrong for someone to use this product, therefore we're going to ban it. Well, again, we have to be clear. We have to be mindful of the unintended consequences. That's the economist's way of thinking about it. That, by and large, is an easy lift. Here's all the stuff we disapprove of. We at least have to acknowledge that we might make things much worse by banning this or banning that or banning the other thing. So I use pornography here as an example. No one is flourishing when they're secretly scrolling Pornhub at 2:00 in the morning, hidden from everybody. I just don't think that's a particularly healthy way to live. Banning it, I think, is the wrong route for two reasons. One, practical, just unintended consequences. Like I said, that's the easy lift. Second, I think that if people do, in fact, bear the image of God, that puts some very, very sharp constraints on what we can and cannot force them to do. So an important part, I think, of respecting the dignity of the individual, and again, I say the dignity of the individual who, in my view, does, in fact, reflect the image of God, is allowing them, well, not allowing, I don't think allowing is the right word, respecting their right to make decisions even if we don't like them, specifically their right to make self-destructive decisions. I don't think that we fully respect the image of God or just the inherent dignity of the human person in somebody when we try to force them into our particular mold or our particular understanding of what a good life looks like. We can try to persuade all we want. We can use web blockers and things like that will restrict our access to pornography. We can talk with the people around us about, okay, we think this is degrading and we think this is bad for you for all them set of reasons. But I think ultimately, God respects people's right to choose, to coin a phrase. And we see this in the creation narrative, that God was not going to force Adam and Eve to bend to his will always and all the time. They had a choice, and it had to be a choice in order, I think, for it to matter or to have any weight. So my two reasons for opposing prohibition are: the first is purely consequential. I think that the cure is worse than the disease. And then the second is, I don't think that we're respecting the image of God in people, particularly grown men and women, if we are treating them like incompetent children. Can't remember if we put this in the book, or this is one of the things that ended up on the cutting room floor, like we were talking about before we started talking. Obviously, like someone who is feeding, clothing, and diapering his 1-year-old that's everybody expects that. Someone who's spoon feeding and diapering a teenager, that's something a little bit more monstrous. And I think we're in the second category when we are not allowing people to make self-destructive decisions.
Let me ask you a follow-up on that, Art. How far down the road of self-destruction are you comfortable going?
That's a good question. And that's one that I struggle with. When self-destruction becomes other destruction, then I think that's when it's time to say, okay, yeah, no, you can't hurt somebody else. And I want to take a sort of like a very, very strict view of that. Making me feel sad is not necessarily hurting me in a legal sense. But when you start to violate the person and property of others, that's when being self-destructive is something that can be punishable. And in that case, it's not the self-destruction that's being punished, it's the violation of others' rights.
Well, let's maybe not think about punishment, but let's think about intervention for a second. And would you be willing to allow somebody to wither away due to a heroin addiction, as long as it never touched the rights of others?
That's a tough one. And there, I think this gets back to the destination versus direction thing. Yeah, sure. Like if we get to the point where the state is small enough that all it's doing is running mental institutions and, providing space for heroin addict, like hardcore heroin addicts in there, okay, then sure, that might be something that is acceptable. Directionally, though, I think we're a long, long, long way from that. And here I think about a lot of the type of self-destructive behavior that I see from everybody: college students, adults, children, the elderly. A lot of these, unfortunately, I think we enable by just letting go off the hook again and again and again and again and again for their poor choices and their bad behavior. There's a large extent to which local knowledge, I think, is really important too, because we all have experience with loved ones that have suffered as a result of substance abuse. I can know a lot more about my own local situation and what is appropriate for it, and also the backstory on how these sort of substance abuse issues have emerged. I can't know that necessarily about people that I don't know, about people that I pass sleeping in the park. I struggle with the fact that for a lot of the homeless I encounter, say in Birmingham, this is obviously a lifestyle choice. Maybe it's driven perhaps by substance abuse, it's driven perhaps by serious mental illness, but at some point I can't believe that me handing a sandwich to someone who's sleeping in the park, even though they're surrounded by social service agencies, is really serving them.
Well, let me ask you the most difficult question that we tend to ask people, and it's one that Ant and I have wrestled with over years of talking to each other. What do we owe each other? And Ant and I have decided, to whatever degree we have decided this, that the answer to that question is never nothing. But the answer to that question might not be a whole hell of a lot either.
Right.
So where do you land on that one, and why, more importantly?
That's a good question. I think more than anything, we owe one another respect. And we owe one another specifically the sort of recognition of their dignity. And that includes the perils that come with poor choices having negative consequences. I think the closer people get to each other morally. So I think, for example, like I owe my kids a lot more than I owe either of you. I owe my dad a lot more than I owe complete strangers. We owe the most to the people who are closest to us, in part because we have a lot of local knowledge and we know the detailed backstories. The farther we get from each other morally, the less we can know and the less efficiently and effectively we can monitor. So we owe less to people the farther they get away from us. Or it becomes more important relatively for us to respect their negative liberties than for us to sort of satisfy their positive rights.
For listeners, what Art just said is we owe to leave them alone. That's the negative rights, as opposed to actively give them something, which is a positive right.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. My obligations to my kids, obviously, that's food, clothing, shelter. My obligation to a complete stranger on the other side of the world is much more in the leave them alone camp than it is anything else. And of course, obviously, you're not to take advantage of them by force or fraud.
Art, in the book, I was so delighted you talked about this because I've never heard an economist talk about this, but I've heard plenty of theologians, and it's something I think is really important, and it would be fruitful for economists to talk about, and that is the dignity of work.
Yes, the dignity of work, I think, is really important. There's an element of consumption value about work. And obviously, some people enjoy their jobs to a certain extent. Economists can capture this a little bit in models of compensating differentials and things like that. But when we talk about the dignity of work, I think we're talking about something that is fundamentally is most capital H human about us. From my perspective as a Christian, it's that we get to be co-creators with God or sub-creators with God, however you choose to define it, or whichever phrase you want to use. We are very much like God when we are exercising our creative faculties, when we're not creating something out of nothing, but taking the something around us and making something new, making something better, making something beautiful, making something that makes it possible for the strangers that we talked about a minute ago, people on the other side of the world that we may never see, we may never get to know, we may not even like them if we met them, but to make it possible for them to take care of their loved ones and the people and the causes that matter to them the most. I think that's an important element of work. One that economics, I don't think, is particularly well equipped to speak to. Economists might be well equipped to speak to it, but I think economics as such is going to be kind of limited in its ability to really talk about work as a dignified enterprise.
But the thing that really strikes me is people who support the welfare state, even free marketers to an extent, regard work as a negative thing rather than a humanizing thing. The most beautiful examples I can think of are the piecemeal laws that, to my knowledge, were designed specifically for people who have developmental disabilities. They can't hold down real jobs, and so they're paid literally for assembling pieces of something. You work for a business and paid far below the minimum wage. But the point isn't the work. It isn't that the company turn a profit. It's that the person have some meaning in their life. I get up, I go, and I do this thing.
Yeah. So I remember the movie Dave. I don't know if you guys remember this from the 90s, the guy who looked exactly like the president and was hired to imitate the president, and the president died and he started acting presidential. Something that's always stuck with me has been him talking about make it the government's job to find a job for everyone in America. Now I look back at that and say, okay, maybe that's not such a hot idea. But he talked about how there's really no better feeling than looking yourself in the mirror and saying that you're going to do something important. You're going to create something. You're going to work, that you're going to improve your own life and the lives of the people around you. There's an element of that in everything. And in the case of the piecemeal work that you're talking about, even the most limited among us can contribute something. And I think there's a lot of dignity to that. There's a lot of honor to that. And there's a lot of very deep human meaning that comes from knowing that you're a contributor. So I do know that one of the things that's surrounded a little bit of the debate over universal basic incomes and things like that has been the fact that people are realizing they're not getting existential satisfaction from mere material consumption. Phrase that I use pretty regularly, and I think it might be in the book again, like we were saying, there's some stuff there's a lot that ended up on the cutting room floor, and sometimes I forget what's there and what's not. If you're looking for the meaning of life and to satisfy all of your questions about human meaning in the snack food aisle at Walmart, then you're looking in the wrong place. There's much more to life than consumption. The production element of it is one aspect of what it means to participate in God's creation that probably doesn't get as much attention as it could or as it deserves.
Art used a couple of words that really tickled me, dignity and honor, two things that I think we've really lost sight of in my lifetime. And coupling that with the other discussion on the work, I think it's largely a matter of understanding that you're useful and valuable, that you have something to contribute, right? And most people don't feel useful anymore. Therefore, dignity and honor are foreign concepts to them. And I'm wondering how we might be able to bring these things back into focus.
That's a really good question. From a policy perspective, what I tell audiences when they ask, well, what do we do? I'm a big fan of Brian Kaplan and his work on immigration, his work on housing. If we work to get rid of barriers to entry into different jobs, different professions, get rid of labor market transaction costs, make it easier to build housing and things like that, then we're inviting people in to this dignity and this honor that comes with being a contributor, that comes with being a creator, that comes with being able to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I did a thing that helped other people. I think that would be a big step in the right direction. I'm bullish on regulation under the second Trump administration, in part because of the appointment of Casey Mulligan at the Small Business Administration. He's done a lot of really good work on the costs and burdens of regulation. And while I don't expect the regulatory leviathan to disappear between now and 2028, I expect it to at least be shackled a little bit. That would be from a policy perspective, to say, let's get rid of all this stuff that's getting in the way of people working. To kind of continue that just a teeny little bit, my older son, who's 16 right now, has tried to no avail to get a job previously. And it's been really enlightening to see the rules that govern you if you're under 16 and want to work, like want to work an actual job. You have to have permission from your school, for example. So if I were in a position to hire, I would say 16 and up only. And in fact, a lot of places have said that. Now that he's 16, he's working on some other stuff. I'm not sure if he's going to try to go back into the labor force. Again, it might be a little bit easier this time around. But I think getting rid of a lot of those restrictions that keep, able-bodied teenagers out of paid employment would be another thing that we could kind of laser focus on.
I've had teenage sons. They need something to do.
They do, yes. In fact, actually, I spend a lot of time coming up with stuff for them to do. He actually helps me with a lot of projects. Mm-hmm. And his name, maybe not in this book, but in a handful of other things I've done. Thanking my sons for research assistance and good conversation. In the household, too, I think we can expect a lot more out of our kids. And I'd like to hope that one of the reasons that our kids are decent, upstanding people at the ages of 12, 14, and 16 is that they've been contributors to the functioning of the household for pretty much since they were old enough to walk. Obviously, we weren't sending them out into the factories or anything like that. But at some point, you're big enough to put away the silverware. And I think we can recapture a lot of the dignity of contribution by expecting a little bit more out of our kids. Over the weekend, I actually paid our oldest to replace the bulb in one of the turn signals on my car because I don't want to do this. My time's too valuable. It was neat because he was clearly very proud of himself for having figured it out and gone to the auto parts place and done all the work he needed to do it. And the money I paid him was nice, but it seemed like that was almost secondary to the joy that came from productive work.
Art, this has been wonderful. Thank you. Take a minute and tell our listeners where they can get a copy of your book.
Yeah, so you can pre-order it right now anywhere fine books are sold, Amazon.com, various other places. The book will appear on April 1st. And you can go to the website mereconomics.com to find where you can order the book, to find out some more about Caleb and myself, and to find a series of blog posts we're writing to accompany the book. And in fact, I'm hoping that might speak to some of the questions you guys had here and that will maybe make their way into the second edition. So go to mereconomics.com. You can find out more about this book, find out more about the other things we've written, and you can join the conversation.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.